The moment Ida Holloway walked into the Crestwood town hall on that sweltering August evening in 1882, she already knew that the men gathered there had decided to take everything from her, and the only question left was whether anyone in that dusty, lantern-lit room would have the courage to say otherwise. The town of Crestwood sat in the heart of the New Mexico Territory, a sun-bleached collection of storefronts and saloons pressed up against the red earth like a man leaning into the wind. It was the kind of town that had grown fast and mean, fed by cattle drives and silver rumors, populated by men who had come west looking for fortune, and had found instead a life of hard labor and harder choices. The main street was wide enough for two wagons to pass side by side, and the dust never quite settled, not even in the dead of night when the horses were stabled and the saloon piano had gone quiet. It was 1882, and the territory was still raw and unpredictable. A place where law existed mostly on paper and justice was whatever the strongest man in the room decided it was. Ida was 26 years old, and she had the kind of face that people remembered not because it was the most beautiful face they had ever seen, but because it was honest in a way that most faces were not. There was no performance in her expression, no careful arrangement of features designed to please. Her dark brown eyes were direct and unafraid. Her jaw was set with a firmness that had been carved there by 3 years of running a cattle ranch alone after her father's death. She wore a plain gray dress that showed the dust of the road, and her dark hair was pulled back from her face, and she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had learned that the world did not offer dignity freely, but that it could be demanded if you were willing to fight for it. She had ridden the 4 miles from the Holloway ranch into town that evening because she had heard, through the circuitous and unreliable network of gossip that served as the territory's primary form of communication, that a man named Harlan Fitch intended to present papers at tonight's town meeting claiming that her father's ranch belonged to him. That the Holloway land, all 460 acres of it, the land her father Thomas Holloway had worked for 20 years and that she had worked for 3 years after his death, was somehow, through some legal sleight of hand that she did not yet understand, no longer hers. The town hall was a large rectangular building with plank walls and a roof that leaked in 3 places when it rained. Benches had been arranged in rows facing a long table at the front, where Mayor Gerald Brandt sat alongside the town alderman, his broad red face gleaming with perspiration beneath his gray hat. The room was full, perhaps 60 or 70 men, ranchers and shopkeepers and laborers, and when Ida entered, the conversations dipped and several heads turned. She was not unknown in Crestwood. She was Thomas Holloway's daughter, and Thomas Holloway had been a man of some standing, a man who had helped 3 other homesteaders keep their land during the drought of 1879, a man who had donated lumber to build the church and had organized the first cattle drive that put Crestwood on the map for the stockyards in Santa Fe. But Thomas was dead, and standing in Crestwood in 1882 as a woman alone with land was a precarious position. She found a seat near the back, nodding to a few people she recognized. Martha Kane, the blacksmith's wife, pressed her hand briefly and whispered that she had come to witness whatever happened tonight. Old Pete Garza, who ran the feed store and had known Thomas Holloway since before Ida was born, gave her a long, worried look from across the room. Harlan Fitch sat near the front with the confidence of a man who believed the outcome of the evening was already settled. He was 51 years old, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a steel-gray mustache and small, watchful eyes that moved over the room with the patient calculation of a man who had spent his life arranging things to his advantage. He owned 3 ranches in the territory already, and had recently come into a relationship with a land speculation company out of Denver that was buying up homestead property and reselling it at inflated prices to Eastern investors who wanted a piece of the romantic West without actually having to live in it. Beside him sat his lawyer, a thin, pinched-faced man named Archibald Prout, who had ridden up from Santa Fe, and who now arranged his papers on his knee, with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood that he was being paid very well to win tonight. Ida had no lawyer. She had ridden into town with her father's original land deed folded in the inside pocket of her dress, and a certainty in her chest that was harder than iron and more painful than she would allow anyone to see. The meeting opened with the usual business, a dispute over water rights on the eastern edge of town, a proposal to repair the bridge over Crestwood Creek before the fall rains made it impassable, a discussion about whether to formally request that a U.S. Marshal be assigned to the territory on a more permanent basis. Ida sat through all of it with her hands folded in her lap and her jaw tight. Then Mayor Brandt, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man who had already decided where his bread was buttered, announced the matter of the Holloway land. Archibald Pruitt rose immediately, smoothing his coat, and began to speak in the measured, precise tones of a man who had delivered legal arguments before and knew how to make complicated things sound inevitable. He explained that Harlan Fitch held a promissory note signed by Thomas Holloway in the year 1878, 4 years ago, a note in the amount of $2,000, which had been borrowed against the land as collateral. He explained that Thomas Holloway had made several payments, but that a final payment of $800 remained outstanding at the time of Thomas's death in 1879. He explained that under the laws of the territory as well as the terms of the note itself, the land was forfeit upon default, and that Harlan Fitch was therefore the rightful owner of the 460 acres currently occupied by Miss Ida Holloway. The room was very quiet. Ida could feel the weight of it, the way everyone present was holding their breath, the way several men looked at her with what might have been sympathy, but what was, in the end, simply the helpless pity of people who had already concluded that nothing could be done. Mayor Brandt looked at her from the front of the room. "Miss Holloway," he said with the careful tone of a man who wished he were somewhere else, "do you have anything to say in response?" Ida stood. Her voice was steady. "I do not believe my father signed any such note," she said, "and I have his deed right here, clear and unencumbered, dated 1862, registered with the Territory Land Office in Santa Fe." She held up the folded document. "No one ever spoke to me about any debt. My father never mentioned it. I have kept every record from his estate, and I have found no evidence of this note whatsoever." Pruitt smiled thinly. "The note exists, Miss Holloway. Your father's signature has been verified." "By whom?" Ida asked. "By 2 witnesses present in this room tonight," Pruitt said, and gestured to 2 men in the third row whom Ida did not recognize. She felt the ground shifting under her, felt the careful architecture of the trap becoming visible. 2 witnesses she had never seen before in her life, a document she had never heard of, a lawyer from Santa Fe, and a mayor who would not meet her eyes. She was 26 years old, and she was standing in a room full of people watching her lose the only thing left in the world that was truly hers. She looked around the room, searching for any face that might hold something more than pity. Old Pete Garza stared at his boots. Martha Kane's hand had gone to her mouth. Several other men looked away. And then, from the back of the room near the left side wall where the shadows pooled beneath the lantern light, a man stood up. He was not a particularly large man, though he was broad in the shoulders and lean in the way that a man gets who spends his days in physical labor under a hard sun. He was perhaps 29 or 30, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of jaw that held a permanent shadow of stubble, no matter how recently he had shaved. He wore a plain canvas shirt and worn leather boots, and his hat was pushed back from his face in a way that was either casual or deliberate, or perhaps both. His eyes, when they caught the light, were a deep warm brown, and they were fixed on Archibald Pruitt with an expression of calm, measured contempt. Ida did not know his name. She had seen him once or twice in town, in the way that you see people in a small town without ever learning who they are. A man who worked for one of the ranches on the North Road, she thought, or perhaps he was passing through. She would learn later that he had been in Crestwood for 6 weeks, hired on as a hand at the Carver Ranch while the Carver family waited on the arrival of their oldest son from Missouri. His name was Daniel Walker. "That land belongs to her," Daniel Walker said, "and I will prove it." The room erupted. Several men started talking at once. Mayor Brandt slammed his hand on the table and called for order. Harlan Fitch turned in his seat and studied the man who had spoken with the flat, measuring look of someone calculating a threat. Archibald Pruitt's thin smile did not waver, but something shifted in his eyes. Daniel Walker did not sit back down. He walked forward through the murmuring room with the unhurried stride of a man who had made a decision and was not revisiting it. And he stopped in front of the long table where the mayor and aldermen sat, and turned to face the room with his back to them, which was either rude or magnificent depending on where you were sitting. "My name is Daniel Walker," he said, his voice carrying easily through the room, a voice accustomed to open country and distance. "I've been working the Carver Ranch for 6 weeks, and before that I spent 2 years as a deputy land surveyor for the territory office in Santa Fe. I know land law in the New Mexico territory about as well as that man in the good coat does, and I'm telling you that this proceeding is not legal." Pruitt's smile finally did slip. "On what basis do you make that claim?" he asked, his tone sharpening. "On the basis that a promissory note held against homestead land as collateral cannot be enforced in a public meeting," Daniel said. "A creditor's claim against property requires a formal judicial process, a hearing before a territorial judge, with proper notice given to the property holder, in this case Miss Holloway, no less than 30 days in advance. This meeting has no legal authority to transfer title of any land. None. The mayor can vote to fix the bridge all he wants, but he cannot vote to take a woman's ranch away from her, and anyone who tells you different is either mistaken or lying." The room had gone very quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Ida stood very still and looked at Daniel Walker's profile. She was aware of something opening up inside her chest, something that might have been hope and that she was afraid to name precisely, yet in case it turned out to be nothing. Harlan Fitch rose from his seat. "Son," he said, with the practiced patience of a man whose preferred method of conflict was slow and economic rather than immediate, "nobody is deciding anything tonight. We are simply establishing the facts for the record." "Then there is no need for Miss Holloway to be distressed," Daniel said, turning to look at Fitch directly. "And there is no need for any of this tonight. If you have a legitimate legal claim, file it through the proper channel in Santa Fe. A court will hear it. Note is genuine, you'll win. If it isn't, you won't." He paused. "I suspect you already know which of those is true." The room crackled with the tension of it. Fitch's face had darkened, and for a moment his composure slipped enough that several men in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Then he settled back, rearranged his expression, and sat down with a controlled deliberateness that was more frightening than anger would have been. "I'll have my hearing," he said quietly. "Then have it," Daniel said. Mayor Brandt, who had been watching all of this with the expression of a man watching a building on fire from a safe distance, cleared his throat and moved briskly to the next item of business. The meeting continued. Ida sat back down on her bench, and the woman beside her, Martha Kane, exhaled a long breath that she appeared to have been holding since Daniel Walker had first spoken. After the meeting concluded and people began to file out into the warm August night, Ida stood near the door and waited. She was not entirely sure why she was waiting. She was not the kind of woman who waited for men to come to her. She had managed her ranch alone for 3 years, had handled calves and droughts and hired hands and a leaking roof, and a year when the cattle prices dropped so severely, she had eaten beans for 6 weeks rather than sell any of her breeding stock. She did not need a man to handle her affairs, but she did need to thank this one, and she did need to understand what he had offered to do, what exactly he had meant when he said he would prove it. Daniel Walker came through the door and nearly walked past her before he caught himself and stopped. Up close in the softer light coming through the hall windows, he was younger looking than he had seemed inside, or perhaps younger than his bearing suggested. There was something about his eyes that was very direct, not harsh, but undisguised, as if he had decided at some point in his life that the world was not worth performing for. "Miss Holloway," he said. "Mr. Walker," she said. "I want to thank you." He shook his head slightly. "Don't thank me yet. I said I'd prove it, and I mean to, but it will take some doing. Do you have documentation of your father's estate? Records, receipts, correspondence, anything?" "I have his deed," she said. "And I have a ledger of accounts going back 8 years. But if what you are saying is true, and there has to be a proper legal hearing, how long do we have before Fitch can move forward?" "He'll need to file in Santa Fe," Daniel said. "Given the distance and the time it takes the court to schedule these things, you're probably looking at 2 or 3 months, maybe longer. But we need to move now, not wait on his timing." He paused, studying her face in that unguarded way he had. "Would you be willing to let me look at what you have? The documents, the ledger. If the signature on that note is a forgery, and I believe it is, there are people who can verify it. I know a man in Santa Fe, a notary and document examiner who has testified in land cases before." Ida looked at him steadily. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. It was not an accusation. It was a genuine question, asked with the directness of a woman who had learned that understanding people's motives was more useful than accepting their assistance blindly. Daniel was quiet for a moment. The night air moved around them, warm and carrying the smell of dust and dried grass and the faint sweetness of the mesquite blooms that grew along the road. "I grew up watching my family lose their land," he said at last. "Back in Tennessee, when I was a boy. A man came with papers and a lawyer and the right kind of words, and my father didn't have any of those things, and we lost the farm. I was 10 years old. He looked out at the dark street. I went to work for the Territory Land Office because I figured knowing the law was the best way to make sure that kind of thing stopped happening to people who didn't deserve it." He looked back at her. "You don't deserve it, Miss Holloway, and I know what a forged document looks like." There was a long moment between them, warm and full of something neither of them was quite ready to name. "Come to the ranch tomorrow morning," Ida said. "I'll have everything laid out for you." He nodded. "I'll be there." She rode home through the desert night with the stars scattered overhead like a broken mirror, and the dry heat still rising from the red earth around her. She thought about the meeting, about Harlan Fitch's quiet, patient anger, about the mayor's careful neutrality, about the 2 strangers who had said they recognized her father's signature on a note that her father had never, to her knowledge, signed. She thought about Daniel Walker, the way he had stood up without hesitation, without calculation, the way he had spoken about his father's land in Tennessee with a pain that was old and settled into him but still very real. She thought that a man who carried that kind of story, who had shaped his entire professional life around preventing its repetition, was probably not a man who did anything without meaning it. She arrived home to the ranch house, a solid adobe structure with a covered porch and 2 rooms that her father had added to over the years, and she lit the lamp in the main room and sat down at the table with her father's papers spread out before her. The deed, the ledger. A collection of letters from the Territory Land Office. Her father's will, probated in 1879 through the office of a Justice of the Peace in Santa Fe, leaving everything to Ida. She went through it all with the lamp turned up high, and she found nothing, not a single reference to a note borrowed from Harlan Fitch or anyone else, not a record of a payment, not a letter, not a receipt. The forgery was thorough. She understood that. Whoever had made it had counted on the lack of a paper trail being interpreted as carelessness on her father's part rather than evidence that the note had never existed. But absence of evidence was not the same as evidence, and she knew her father's hand, the precise, careful script he had learned from a schoolteacher in Virginia before the war, and she knew with a bone-deep certainty that whatever signature appeared on Harlan Fitch's note, it was not Thomas Holloway's. She went to bed late, and her sleep was thin and restless. And in the half-dreams that moved through her mind, she kept seeing Daniel Walker standing up in that lantern-lit room with the easy, unafraid certainty of someone who had already decided what was right. He arrived the next morning as she was finishing the breakfast dishes, riding a bay horse that he tied at the fence post with the practiced efficiency of a man who spent most of his time around horses. He took his hat off when he came to the door, which was a courtesy she noted without ceremony, and when she laid everything out on the kitchen table, he sat across from her and went through it all with a quiet, methodical focus that she found unexpectedly reassuring. He was not performing competence. He simply had it. "Tell me about your father's dealings with Harlan Fitch," he said, without looking up from the ledger. Ida poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down. "My father and Harlan Fitch did not have dealings," she said. "They knew each other. Crestwood is a small town, but my father did not trust Fitch. He told me once when I was maybe 15 or 16 that Fitch was a man who wore patience like a coat, that you had to watch him carefully because by the time you understood what he was after, he already had it." Daniel looked up at that. Something shifted in his expression. "Your father sounds like a perceptive man." "He was," she said simply. Daniel turned back to the ledger. He had a way of concentrating that was complete, nothing performing, just his full attention given over to the task, and Ida found herself watching him more than she intended. She was not the kind of woman who spent her time noticing men in that way. She had had a brief, awkward courtship 3 years ago, before her father died, with a rancher's son named William Pratt who had been perfectly decent and thoroughly unsuitable, and who had eventually married a girl from Albuquerque with a sizable dowry. Ida had not been particularly sorry. She had enough to occupy herself. But Daniel Walker was different in a way that was difficult to articulate. He was in her house, at her table, going through her father's papers, and she did not feel intruded upon. She felt instead as if something that had been very difficult was suddenly, slightly, less difficult than it had been the day before. "Here," Daniel said, tapping the ledger. "1878, look at this." She leaned across the table. He was pointing to an entry from September of 1878, a payment out of $200 described simply as settlement with HF. She frowned. "I always thought that was payment for grazing rights," she said. "Fitch owned the parcel adjacent to my father's east pasture. They had an arrangement. My father paid him a seasonal fee to let our cattle water at his creek." Daniel looked at her. "You're certain about that?" "My father wrote it in his letters to me," she said. She rose and went to the small box where she kept the personal correspondence and sorted through it quickly. She found 2 letters from her father dated 1878, both referencing the payment and describing it explicitly as grazing and water rights. She handed them to Daniel. He read them carefully, twice, and then set them down on the table with the deliberate satisfaction of a man placing the last stone in a wall. "If Fitch claims the $200 payment as a partial payment on his promissory note," he said, "these letters directly contradict that interpretation. They establish that the payment was for something else entirely. That is a very significant inconsistency." He paused. "What I need to do is get to Santa Fe and speak with William Ortega, the document examiner I mentioned. If he can examine the original note and compare the signature to authenticated samples of your father's handwriting from these letters and from legal documents in the territory records, we will have expert testimony that the note is forged." Ida folded her hands on the table. "How long will that take?" "If I leave in the next few days, I can be back within 3 weeks. Fitch won't have filed anything in Santa Fe yet. He'll want to give his legal position time to settle before he commits to court proceedings. We have time, but we shouldn't waste it." She looked at him. "You are willing to ride to Santa Fe and back for this?" He held her gaze, and there was nothing theatrical in it, nothing designed to impress. "I said I would prove it," he said. "I meant it." She nodded slowly. "Then I will pay your expenses. We can discuss that when it's done," he said. He stayed another hour, carefully copying down the relevant entries from the ledger and making notes about the letters in his own small, precise handwriting. Ida made more coffee, and eventually They sat on opposite sides of the table, talking not about the legal matter, but about the ranch itself, about the cattle, about the specific challenges of running a homestead in the territory as a single woman, about the way the town treated her, with a mixture of grudging respect and a persistent assumption that she must eventually fail. She told him about the autumn of 1880 when she had lost 14 head to a sudden illness that spread through the herd and had nearly broken her, and about how she had nursed the remaining animals through the winter by herself and come out in the spring with a herd that was smaller but entirely healthy, and that had grown steadily since. He listened in the way that good listeners do, not waiting for a gap to speak, but actually absorbing what she said, asking questions that showed he had heard the details. And when he talked, it was with the same quality, a man who chose his words carefully not because he was guarding himself but because he meant them. He told her more about the land surveyor work in Santa Fe, about the cases he had seen, the number of homesteaders who had lost their land to exactly the kind of paper manipulation that Fitch was attempting, the way the law was supposed to prevent it, but often did not because the people with lawyers and money moved faster than the people with honest claims and no resources. "The territory is changing," he said at one point, looking out through the kitchen window at the flat, sun-beaten landscape beyond. "In 10 years, maybe 20, this will be a state. There'll be proper courts and proper records, and this kind of thing will be harder to do. But right now we are still in the years where the law is whatever the most powerful man in the room decides it is, and that is dangerous for people like your father and like you. And like your family in Tennessee," she said. He looked at her, and there it was again, that quality of unguardedness, as if he had decided she was worth being honest with. "Yes," he said, "and like them." He left in the early afternoon, riding north toward the Carver Ranch to arrange his leave of absence, and Ida stood on the porch and watched him go with a sensation that was somewhere between gratitude and an emotion she was not yet ready to examine too closely. The next 3 weeks were among the strangest of her life. She worked the ranch as she always did, rising before dawn, checking the herd, managing the 2 hired hands she had kept on since her father's death, a laconic older man named Hector, and a quiet young Mexican man named Raphael who had worked the Holloway ranch since he was 16, and who was, in Ida's estimation, better with horses than anyone else in the county. She fixed fences. She negotiated with a buyer from Santa Fe who came through looking for breeding cattle. She rode the east pasture checking for the dry grass patches that could turn dangerous if the late summer heat stayed high. She did everything she always did. But at night she found herself thinking about Daniel Walker with an intensity that surprised her. Not in a fanciful way, not in the way of women in the novels that came through occasionally from the lending library in Santa Fe. In a more specific and practical way, she thought about the quality of his attention when he listened to her, about the way he had stood up in that town hall without hesitating, about the story of his family's land in Tennessee and what it had cost him, and what he had built from that cost. She thought about the look in his eyes when he talked about the territory changing, a look that was neither cynical nor naively hopeful, but something in between, the look of a person who understood that the world was imperfect and was nonetheless committed to improving his particular corner of it. She recognized something in him that she had not expected to find in a man she had only just met, a kind of integrity that was structural, built into the framework of him, not a performance or a decision made fresh each day, but simply the way he was made. Her father had had that quality. Most men she knew did not. He sent a message through a passing rider on the 12th day, a brief note in his small handwriting that said he had reached Santa Fe and spoken with William Ortega, and that Ortega had agreed to examine the note and would have a written assessment within the week. He said he had also visited the Territory Land Records office and found something of interest that he would explain when he returned. He said nothing else, but the note was folded with care, and at the bottom, in a slightly different pressure of pen as if added as an afterthought, it said simply, The ranch will be yours. I am certain of it." She folded the note and put it with her father's letters. Daniel returned on the 22nd day, arriving at the ranch in the early evening when the sky was turning the deep orange and purple of a territory sunset, the kind of extravagant display of color that seemed almost too dramatic to be real. Ida was on the porch when she saw him coming up the road, and she set down the mending she had been doing and stood up without quite deciding to. He was carrying a leather satchel and looked tired in the way of a man who has ridden hard for many days, but there was something satisfied in his bearing, something resolved, and when he came up to the porch and saw her face, he smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him smile properly, and it rearranged his whole face in a way that was entirely unexpected. "It is forged," he said, before he was even fully dismounted. Ortega confirmed it. "The signature is a copy of your father's authentic signature, a tracing, he believes, probably taken from a public document. The ink composition and the pressure pattern are inconsistent with the other samples. He's prepared to testify to that in writing and in person if the case goes to court." Ida breathed in slowly and out again. "Come inside," she said. She fed him dinner, which felt like the least she could do for a man who had ridden 400 miles in 3 weeks on her behalf, and while they ate he laid out everything he had found. The document examiner's report. A record from the Territory Land Office showing that the parcel of land had been registered clearly in Thomas Holloway's name in 1862 with no encumbrances listed, and that no subsequent encumbrance had ever been filed, which was standard procedure when land was used as collateral for a loan. The absence of that filing was itself a legal problem for Fitch's claim, Daniel explained, because a creditor who accepted land as collateral was required under territory law to file notice of that encumbrance with the land office within 60 days of the note's execution. No such filing existed. So even if the note were genuine, Ida said slowly, following the logic, the claim would be legally deficient because the encumbrance was never registered. Daniel pointed his fork at her with a kind of delighted precision. "Exactly. Ortega found a territorial court ruling from 1877, Blackwood versus Hernandez, that establishes exactly that principle. Without the registered encumbrance, the note cannot attach to the land. Fitch's entire claim fails on 2 independent grounds, the forgery and the procedural failure. Either one is sufficient. Together they are insurmountable." Ida set down her fork and looked at him across the table in the lamplight. "You went to all of this," she said. "You found all of this." "I told you I would," he said simply. There was a quality to the silence between them that had not been there 3 weeks ago, a warmth and a familiarity that had been built by the letters and the trust and the simple fact of what he had done, and Ida was aware that she was looking at him differently than she had looked at anyone in a very long time. "Daniel," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and she felt that in the specific and particular way that you feel the first time a formality drops away between two people. He looked up from the papers. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it with her whole heart, with 3 years of fighting alone and a father's memory and 460 acres of red territory earth, and she thought he understood that because something in his expression changed, something that was usually very controlled in him, and he looked at her with his eyes direct and unguarded and said, "I would do it again." The morning after his return, Daniel rode into Crestwood and presented his findings to Mayor Brandt in a formal letter, with copies of the Ortega report and the relevant legal citations attached. He also sent a letter by post to Harlan Fitch's lawyer in Santa Fe, copied to the Territory Land Office, outlining the 2 independent grounds on which any legal action against the Holloway property would fail and suggesting that Mr. Fitch, if he was wise, would withdraw his interest quietly rather than pursue a case whose outcome was not in doubt. Harlan Fitch was not a man who took losing gracefully, and there was a period of about 2 weeks during which Ida found herself watching the road to town with a tension she could not quite dispel. Fitch did not come to the ranch. He did not make any formal moves. But there was a night when someone cut the wire on her north fence, and another when a steer was found with a cut hide that suggested something deliberate rather than accidental. Daniel, who had remained in Crestwood after speaking to the mayor, came out to the ranch when he heard about the fence and stayed for 2 days, helping repair it and taking his turn watching the perimeter at night with a calm vigilance that said he had taken the situation seriously and was not alarmed by it. It was during those 2 days that something shifted between them in a way that could not be shifted back. They worked alongside each other in the way that people do when there is real work to be done, without performance or self-consciousness, and Ida found that he was easy to be around in the way that very few people were. He did not talk when there was nothing to say, and he did not fill silence with noise for the sake of it, but when he did talk it was worth hearing, and he had a quality of attention when she spoke that she had stopped expecting from men years ago. He listened. He asked questions. He remembered what she had told him the day before, and built on it the next day as if every conversation were a continuous thing, rather than a series of disconnected exchanges. On the second evening, after dinner was done and the dishes washed and Raphael and Hector had gone to their bunkhouse, they sat on the porch in the cooling air and watched the stars come out one by one over the desert. The nights in the territory in late summer were extraordinary, the darkness so absolute and the stars so thick that the sky seemed more light than dark, and the silence was the wide, clean silence of open country rather than the pressing silence of confined spaces. "You grew up somewhere like this?" she asked. "Nothing like this," he said, smiling slightly. "Tennessee is green. Everything is green all the time, and the air is wet and heavy and the trees pressing close. When I first came to the territory, I thought the landscape was hostile, all this space." He looked out at it. "But you adjust, and then one day you realize it isn't hostile at all, it's honest. There's nowhere to hide in a landscape like this. Everything is exactly what it is." She looked at his profile in the starlight. "Do you miss Tennessee?" "I miss my mother," he said without hesitation. "She died when I was 18. She was the best person I've known a beat. She would have liked you." Ida turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, and they were both aware in that moment of exactly what was happening between them, and neither of them moved away from it. "I don't know what to do with you, Daniel Walker," she said, and it came out softer than she intended, more honest, more unguarded. "I think you know exactly what to do with me," he said quietly. "I think you've known since the night you walked out of that town hall." "That is possibly too confident," she said, but she was smiling. "Maybe," he acknowledged. And then, after a pause that was perfectly weighted, "But I'm not wrong." She laughed, genuinely, for the first time in what felt like a very long time, and the sound of it surprised both of them, bright and warm in the night air, and Daniel Walker looked at her with an expression that was open and a little undone, as if he had not expected to feel what he was feeling quite as much as he felt it. They did not kiss that night. The evening ended as the evenings before it had, with a good-natured exchange about the fence repair schedule for the following day, and a practical arrangement about who would take the first watch. But something had been said that could not be unsaid, and as Ida lay in her bed listening to the quiet sounds of the desert and the occasional footstep of the man walking the perimeter of her property, she thought that her life, which had been very sensible and very solitary for 3 years, had become something else in the past month. Something that was more complicated and more alive. Harlan Fitch filed his claim in the Santa Fe Territorial Court on a Thursday morning in late September. Ida received notice from the court clerk by post, a formal document that was both more and less frightening than she had expected, more because it was real and official, and had the weight of institutional power behind it, less because she now had Daniel's research and Ortega's report and the Blackwood precedent, and she understood that the claim was legally weak in multiple ways. Daniel had spoken to a lawyer in Santa Fe, a man named George Alvarado, who had a reputation for handling land cases, and who agreed to represent Ida at a fee that was reasonable given the strength of her case. Alvarado reviewed everything Daniel had assembled and wrote back with a frank assessment. The case, if properly presented, was not a close one. Fitch's claim would not survive. The hearing was scheduled for November. That meant nearly 2 months of waiting, which in ordinary circumstances would have been difficult enough, but which was made considerably less difficult by the fact that Daniel Walker remained in Crestwood. He had spoken to old Mr. Carver about his situation, and Carver, who turned out to be a decent man with a precise understanding of justice, had told Daniel to stay as long as he needed to and that his position at the ranch would remain available. Daniel rode out to the Holloway property most days, sometimes to help with work that needed an extra pair of hands, sometimes simply to sit on the porch in the evening and talk. It was during one of those October evenings, with the heat finally breaking and the desert air taking on a crispness that felt like a gift after the long summer, that Ida understood she was in love with him. Not in the way of novels or of the romantic songs that the saloon piano player occasionally attempted on quiet evenings. In a much more specific and personal way, in the way that you understand something when it has stopped being an abstract possibility and become a concrete, undeniable fact. She loved the steadiness of him. She loved the way he had shown up in her life at its most difficult moment without being asked, and had immediately set himself to the business of making things right, not because he wanted anything from her, but because that was simply what he did. She loved the way he talked about the territory, with a genuine care for its future that was not sentimental but practical and committed. She loved the way he laughed, which was infrequent but entirely sincere. She loved the long, specific silences between them that felt more comfortable than most people's conversations. She did not tell him any of this yet. She was not a woman who did things without being certain, and she was certain of her own feelings but not yet entirely certain of his, and the matter of the ranch and the court case was not yet resolved, and she thought it was important to let those things stay separate until they could be properly separated. But she let herself sit beside him in the evenings without pretending the warmth she felt was merely gratitude, and she thought he knew. The case brought other complications. One of the 2 men who had claimed to recognize Thomas Holloway's signature at the town meeting was discovered, through Daniel's quiet and methodical inquiries, to be a man named Cal Warden who had previous legal trouble in Colorado territory, a man who made his living, when he could not find honest work, by providing convenient testimony for people willing to pay for it. Daniel brought this information to George Alvarado, who incorporated it into the legal brief. The other witness, when faced with a formal deposition request from Alvarado's office, suddenly discovered that he had urgent business in Arizona and left Crestwood before he could be formally questioned. Harlan Fitch, it turned out, had done this before, not in the territory but in Colorado. Daniel had written to a former colleague at the land office who had connections in Colorado, and the information that came back was quietly damning. 2 homesteaders in Colorado had lost property to Fitch in very similar circumstances: forged notes, paid witnesses, a lawyer who knew which legal gaps to exploit. One of those homesteaders, an older man named Clement Shaw, had died 2 years after losing his property, and his family believed the loss of the land had killed him as surely as the stroke that had actually done it. Daniel told Ida this on a cold October afternoon while they were mending the south pasture fence together, and her jaw set in a way he had come to recognize. "He has done this before," she said. "Yes," Daniel said, "and nobody stopped him." "Nobody had what we have," Daniel said, "the documentation, the legal knowledge, and the willingness to fight." Ida drove a fence post into the red earth with a precision that expressed a great deal. "He will not do this to anyone else after I am done with him," she said. Daniel looked at her over the fence wire, and something in his expression was very warm and very unguarded. "No," he agreed. "He won't." They rode to Santa Fe together the week before the hearing, A 2-day ride through country that was spectacular in the late October light. The cottonwoods along the river bottoms turned to gold, the sky an absolute and undeniable blue. They stayed at separate lodging houses and spent their days with George Alvarado preparing for the hearing, going through documents and testimony, and the specific points of law that would need to be addressed. But in the evenings they walked together through the old streets of Santa Fe, which was the oldest European settled city in the territory. Its adobe walls and narrow streets a world away from the raw, provisional feeling of Crestwood. And they talked in the easy and ranging way of two people who have run out of pretenses and are simply glad to be in each other's company. On the second evening, they sat on a bench in the plaza near the palace of the governors, and the air was cold enough that their breath made small clouds, and the stars overhead were the same extravagant stars as at the ranch, but viewed from the middle of a city. They felt both more and less intimate, and Daniel said, without particular preamble, "I want to ask you something." Ida turned to look at him. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was sometimes quiet when he was arranging words carefully because they mattered. "When this is settled," he said, "when the case is done and the land is secure and all of this is resolved, I'd like to continue seeing you, not for any practical reason. For the other kind." He paused. "I know this is a strange time to say it with the case happening and everything uncertain, but I find that I'm not good at pretending things aren't what they are." Ida sat with this for a moment, the cold night air around them, the faint sounds of Santa Fe settling into its nighttime routines. She thought about 3 years of managing everything alone, about the exhaustion of it and the pride of it, and the loneliness that she had learned to live with the way you learn to live with a limp. She thought about the first night she had seen him stand up in that town hall and the certainty in his voice, the absence of performance. "Daniel," she said, "I think I've been seeing you for the other kind of reason since about the 3rd day." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I should have said something sooner." "You were busy proving I own my land," she said. He laughed, and she loved the sound of it, low and warm in the cold plaza night. And then he took her hand where it lay on the bench between them and held it, and they sat like that for a long time watching the stars, and Ida felt something settle inside her that had been unsettled for a very long time. The hearing before the territorial judge, a spare, precise man named Honorable Jonas Whitfield, who had a reputation for fairness and an impatience with time-wasting, was held on a gray November morning in the Santa Fe courthouse. Harlan Fitch appeared with Archibald Prout and 2 additional lawyers from Denver, who had apparently been retained, when it became clear that the simple presentation in the Crestwood town hall had not resolved the matter in Fitch's favor. The Santa Fe courtroom was oak-paneled and smelled of pipe smoke and paper, and the gallery was half full with interested parties from the legal community and several people from Crestwood who had made the journey, including Pete Garza and Martha Kane, and unexpectedly, 3 other homesteaders whose properties bordered the Holloway land and who had reasons of their own to be interested in the outcome. George Alvarado opened with a clean, methodical presentation of the 2 legal deficiencies in Fitch's claim, the absent encumbrance filing and the forged signature. He presented William Ortega as an expert witness, and Ortega testified with the precise confidence of a man who had spent 30 years examining documents and knew what he was talking about. He explained the tracing method used to reproduce Thomas Holloway's signature, explained how the ink composition could be distinguished from ink used in authentic Holloway documents of the same period, explained the pressure inconsistencies. He was thorough and calm and entirely convincing. Archibald Prout cross-examined Ortega vigorously, but Ortega was not a man who could be rattled by vigorous cross-examination, and every attempt to undermine his testimony was turned aside with the placid certainty of expertise. Prout then presented a counter-expert, a document examiner from Denver, who offered a contradictory assessment, but under Alvarado's cross-examination, it emerged that this examiner had examined only a copy of the original note rather than the note itself, and had not compared the signature against the authentic samples Ortega had used. Judge Whitfield's expression during this revelation was the expression of a man who has seen too much of this kind of thing. The testimony about Cal Warden, the paid witness, was the moment that changed the atmosphere of the room in a palpable way. Alvarado laid out Warden's history in Colorado with the quiet methodicalness of someone stacking weighted stones, and by the time he finished, Harlan Fitch's face had the closed, careful expression of a man who is calculating his options and not finding them favorable. The Denver lawyers made their best arguments. They were not without skill, and they mounted a creditable defense of Fitch's claim, but they were working with a flawed foundation and they knew it, and the quality of their presentation had the slightly hollow quality of men arguing a position they do not themselves entirely believe. Judge Whitfield ruled from the bench at the end of the second day, and he did not make them wait. "The court finds," he said, in the measured tones of a man who had delivered judgments for 23 years, that the promissory note presented by the claimant as the basis for his claim against the Holloway property is fraudulent. The expert testimony on this point is unambiguous and has not been credibly rebutted. Furthermore, the court finds that even had the note been genuine, the failure to file notice of encumbrance with the Territory Land Office within the required period would render the claim against the property legally unenforceable under the 1877 precedent established in Blackwood v. Hernandez. The claim is dismissed in its entirety. The Holloway property, registered in the name of Thomas Holloway and passing by lawful inheritance to his daughter, Ida Holloway, remains the property of Ida Holloway, and no further proceedings to the contrary shall be entertained by this court without material new evidence, of which, I will note, the court does not anticipate any, given the thoroughness with which the fraudulent nature of the claimant's documentation has been demonstrated. He paused, and there was in his next words a quality that was not quite a judicial statement, but that everyone in the room heard and understood. The court also notes that the pattern of conduct described in these proceedings bears certain troubling similarities to matters that have come before courts in other territories. The court will be forwarding its findings to the appropriate territorial authorities for their consideration. Harlan Fitch left the courthouse without speaking to anyone. Archibald Prout gathered his papers with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to losing occasionally and moved on to his next appointment. The Denver lawyers disappeared as if they had never been. In the gallery, Pete Garza blew his nose loudly into his handkerchief and blinked several times in rapid succession. Martha Kane gripped the arm of the woman beside her. The three homesteaders from the properties neighboring the Holloway land looked at each other with the quiet, exhaled relief of men who had understood that their own security was at least partially bound up in this outcome. Ida stood in the middle of the courthouse hallway and felt the weight she had been carrying lift, not all at once but steadily, like a load being set down piece by piece, and her eyes stung in a way she had not expected and that she did not attempt to prevent. Daniel was beside her. He did not say anything immediately. He just stood close to her in that way he had, present and steady, and she turned to look at him, and his eyes were bright with something that was uncomplicated and entirely sincere. "Your ranch," he said. "My ranch," she agreed. And then, because they were in a courthouse hallway in Santa Fe with Pete Garza and Martha Kane watching from 15 feet away, and because she did not particularly care, she stepped forward and put her arms around him and held on, and he held her back, his hand moving to her hair with a tenderness that was not careful or measured but entirely unguarded, and she thought that this was what it felt like, this specific warmth and steadiness, this particular certainty. This was what it felt like to have someone on your side who was completely and permanently there. Pete Garza said something to Martha Kane in a low voice that made her laugh softly. They rode back to Crestwood over 3 days. The territory spread out around them in the cold, clear beauty of early winter, the red earth hard under the horses' hooves, and the sky an impossible shade of blue that only existed in the high desert. They talked the way they had been talking for 2 months, easily and widely, about everything and nothing, about the ranch and the territory and Daniel's plans and Ida's plans, and the way those plans intersected, and the way they might be made to intersect more deliberately. And for the first time, those conversations did not have the quality of futures held carefully apart from each other, but of futures that were being openly, practically, and happily considered together. On the second night of the return ride, camped beside a shallow creek where the cottonwoods still held a few last gold leaves, with the horses picketed nearby and the fire burning warm against the cold night, Daniel sat across from her and said, with the characteristic directness she had come to love, "I'm not going back to the land office in Santa Fe. I don't think I need to." She watched him. "What do you think you need to do?" she asked. "I think," he said slowly, "that I need to stay in the territory, in this part of it." He looked at the fire. "I've been thinking about setting up an independent practice. Not a law firm exactly, I'm not a lawyer, but a land rights consultancy, something that helps homesteaders who are in the position your father was in, who have legitimate claims and no resources to defend them. The territory is full of those people, and men like Fitch know it." He looked up at her. "I spoke to Alvarado in Santa Fe. He's willing to partner on cases where legal representation is required. He thinks there's a real need for it." Ida looked at him for a long moment. The fire crackled between them, and the cottonwood leaves rustled in the cold creek air, and the stars were extraordinary overhead. "And where would you do this work?" she asked. "Well," he said, carefully watching her face, "Crestwood is a reasonable base. It's central in the territory. The land office in Santa Fe is accessible. There are people here who know me now." He paused. "There is a woman here who I intend to court properly if she'll allow it, and I find I'm not interested in being anywhere she isn't." Ida felt the warmth of that move through her like sunlight through a cold morning. "Properly," she said. "I was raised by a good woman," he said. "She had opinions about propriety." "She sounds like someone I would have liked," Ida said. "She would have said exactly the same thing about you," he said, without hesitation. On the last evening before they reached Crestwood, with the familiar shapes of the mesa country around them and the faint lights of town visible in the distance, Daniel pulled his horse up beside hers and said, with the casual certainty that she had come to understand was simply how he spoke when he was most serious, "I am going to ask you to marry me, Ida Holloway. Not tonight, and not because of any urgency. But I want you to know that is my intention, so you can think about it and so there are no surprises." She looked at him in the last of the light, this man who had stood up in a town hall for a woman he did not know, who had ridden 400 miles and spent 3 weeks in Santa Fe, and testified before a territorial judge and repaired her fences, and walked the perimeter of her land at night and held her hand in the plaza, and held her in the courthouse hallway. This steady, particular, utterly sincere man. And she thought about her answer. Not because she did not know it, but because she wanted to give it with the same deliberateness he had given his intention. "I think," she said, "that when you ask, you will find my answer is not difficult." He smiled, and it reached his eyes in that way it had that always caught her, and they rode on toward Crestwood together in the winter dark. He asked her on a Sunday in December, standing in the yard of the Holloway ranch with the cold blue sky overhead, and the cattle moving in the distance and the smell of wood smoke coming from the kitchen chimney. He asked her simply and honestly, without theater, the way he did everything. He told her that he had loved her since about the 4th day, since the morning he had sat at her kitchen table, and she had told him about the autumn of 1880 and the 14 head she had lost, and the way she had nursed the remainder through the winter. And he had looked at her, and understood that she was the most capable and genuine person he had encountered in a very long time, and that he did not want to spend the rest of his life anywhere she was not. She said yes, standing in the yard of her ranch with the winter sun on her face, and the word came out of her whole chest, complete and certain and utterly without reservation. They married in March of 1883, in the Crestwood church that Thomas Holloway had helped build. on a bright cold morning when the desert was just beginning to feel the first tentative warmth of coming spring. The whole town came, because in a small town in the territory in 1883, a wedding was a significant occasion, and also because Ida Holloway was well liked and people were glad that things had come out right for her, and because Daniel Walker had become, in the months since the courthouse, a man that Crestwood had quietly and collectively decided to claim as its own. Pete Garza sat in the front row and cried openly and without embarrassment. Martha Kane had organized the wedding flowers and wore her best dress. Raphael and Hector, Ida's ranch hands, stood near the back in their cleanest clothes with the slightly formal discomfort of men who do not often wear their cleanest clothes. George Alvarado came up from Santa Fe, which was not a small journey, and stood in the gallery with the satisfied expression of a man who had contributed to a good outcome. Ida wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself from fabric ordered from the dry goods store in Santa Fe, and she wore her hair down for perhaps the first time in any public setting since she was a child, dark and long against the blue of the dress. And Daniel Walker, standing at the front of the church waiting for her, looked at her walking up the aisle and had an expression that made several women in the congregation reach for their handkerchiefs. The ceremony was conducted by the Reverend, a gentle, long-winded man named Reverend Moss, who delivered a homily of some length about the virtues of steadfastness in matrimony and the importance of plain dealing between spouses. Ida and Daniel stood side by side through the homily with their shoulders touching and their hands clasped, listening with the patient respect of two people who have arrived at their own understanding of these matters independently, but are willing to hear what the Reverend has to say. When it came to the vows, Daniel said his looking directly at her, in a voice that was quiet enough that the people in the back of the church had to strain to hear, but that carried everything he meant without needing any additional volume. She said hers looking back at him, and she meant every word with the specific weight of a woman who does not use words carelessly. When Reverend Moss pronounced them married and they turned to face the congregation, the church erupted with the enthusiastic approval of 60-odd people who had been waiting for this moment, and who expressed their enthusiasm with stamping feet and hollering that was entirely out of keeping with the solemnity of the occasion, and entirely in keeping with the character of the territory. And Ida laughed out loud, and Daniel caught her around the waist and lifted her off her feet briefly, in a display of unguarded joy that she would remember for the rest of her life. The reception was held in the town hall, which had been cleared of its benches and decorated with ribbons and the first wildflowers of the spring season by Martha Kane, and a committee of women who took these occasions seriously. The food was substantial and good. There was dancing, which the territory did with the same enthusiastic imprecision that it brought to most things, a fiddle player and a guitar, and a man with a harmonica who was better than his instrument had any right to allow. Daniel danced with Ida with a competent ease that surprised her, and when she said so, he told her that his mother had taught him, that she had believed dancing was a fundamental life skill on the same level as riding and cooking, and that she had been correct. They danced together and with other people and together again, and the lanterns burned bright in the hall, and outside the territory night was cold and clear and full of stars. And Ida Holloway, who was now Ida Walker, thought that she had not known it was possible to feel this specific degree of happiness, that she had not understood before tonight that the opposite of loneliness was not merely company but the right company, the person who fit alongside your particular shape. Near midnight, Pete Garza made a toast that was incoherent with emotion and wine, and that nonetheless perfectly captured everything people felt, and Daniel kissed Ida's temple in response and she leaned into him, and in the morning they would ride back to the ranch that was hers, that had always been hers, that would always be hers together. The years that followed were full ones. Daniel established his land rights consultancy in Crestwood in the spring of 1883, operating out of a small office on the main street above the dry goods store. He worked with George Alvarado on cases across the territory, and in his first year he helped 9 homesteaders defend or recover their land claims, several of them against the same kinds of fraudulent documentation schemes that had been used against Ida's father. His reputation spread through the territory's homesteading communities with the particular efficiency of good news among people who need it. And by the end of his second year, he was receiving letters from as far away as Arizona Territory asking for consultation. Harlan Fitch, who had withdrawn from Crestwood after the court ruling and the judge's note to territorial authorities, was investigated by the Territorial Land Office in 1884 for his Colorado dealings. The investigation was thorough, and the outcome was not good for Fitch. He was brought before a Colorado territorial court in 1885 on charges of fraud and document forgery, and was found guilty on 3 counts. He was fined heavily and stripped of 2 of his 3 ranch properties as restitution for the homesteaders he had defrauded in Colorado. He attempted no further legal maneuvering in New Mexico territory. The world continued without him causing harm in it, which was the best outcome anyone could have hoped for. Ida ran the Holloway Ranch, which she renamed Walker Ranch after the marriage, though she kept the Holloway name in her heart and in the careful record books she maintained in her father's memory, with the same competence and commitment she had always brought to it. With Daniel's second income, she was able to expand the herd and hire 2 more hands, and she introduced a small breeding program for quality cattle that, by 1885, had earned the ranch a reputation for good stock throughout the territory. Raphael, who had been with the ranch since before Thomas's death, became the foreman, a title and wage increase that was long overdue and that he accepted with the same quiet dignity with which he did everything. Their son was born in January of 1884, in the ranch house on a cold, clear night when the desert was hard with frost and the stars looked close enough to touch. He was born with Daniel's dark hair and Ida's dark eyes, and a set of lungs that he demonstrated immediately and at length. They named him Thomas Daniel Walker, Thomas for the grandfather who had built the ranch and whose memory lived in every acre of it, Daniel for his father, and the name felt exactly right. Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious boy who loved the land with the instinctive ease of a child who had grown up in it, and who showed, from an early age, his mother's directness and his father's methodical quality of thinking. He could ride before he was 4. He asked questions constantly about the cattle and the law and the stars and the history of the territory, and Daniel and Ida answered them as honestly as they could, which was the only way either of them knew how to operate. Their daughter, Clara, arrived in the spring of 1886, as easy-tempered as her brother was energetic, with a gift for understanding animals that astonished even Ida and that delighted Raphael, who said she had a natural hand with horses that he had rarely seen. She was named Clara Margaret Walker, Margaret for Daniel's mother, and the name pleased him in a way that was deep and private and that Ida understood completely. The ranch grew. The territory grew. In 1887, a proper federal court was established in the county that included Crestwood, which meant that land cases could be heard locally rather than in Santa Fe, and Daniel became a frequent presence in that courtroom, not as a lawyer, but as an expert consultant on land law and documentation, a role that Judge Elijah Crane, a serious and fair man who had come west from Ohio, formalized with an official appointment as court-recognized expert witness in 1888. It was not a lawyer's title, and it did not require a lawyer's credentials, but it carried legal weight, and Daniel used it in the service of the homesteaders and small ranchers who continued to need someone in their corner. There was a case in 1887 that Ida and Daniel discussed for years afterward. A Navajo family named Benelli had been operating a small ranch on land that had been informally allocated to them under an arrangement that predated the formal homestead system, and a speculator from Albuquerque had filed a claim arguing that the informal arrangement had no legal standing and that the land was available for formal claim. It was a different legal situation from the Holloway case, involving different laws and a different history, but it had the same fundamental quality of a powerful man using legal mechanisms to take something from people who deserved to keep it. Daniel took the case, and he took it knowing it was harder than anything he had previously handled, because the injustices done to Native people in the territory were older and deeper, and more systematically entrenched than anything faced by a white homesteader. And the law itself, the very law he worked within, was part of the structure of those injustices. He was honest about that limitation with the Benelli family, honest about what he could and could not do within the existing legal framework. He worked with George Alvarado and with an Indian rights advocate from Washington, D.C., named James Littleton, who came west specifically for the case, and together they mounted a defense based on the documented history of the land use and the territorial government's own written recognition of the arrangement. The speculator's claim was rejected. The Benelli family kept their land. It was not a complete victory. It never was, Daniel told Ida that evening, because the larger injustices were not his to resolve within a single case, and he understood that, but it was the right outcome for the specific people involved, and it was the best he could do, and he had done it as thoroughly as he could. Ida respected this about him deeply. He was not a man who pretended the world was simpler than it was, or that his own position in it was uncomplicated. He saw clearly, and he acted honestly, and he acknowledged the limits of what any single person could accomplish while continuing to push against those limits consistently. She thought her father would have liked him enormously. In the summer of 1888, Ida's third pregnancy did not go as easily as the first two. She was ill through much of the middle months, and there were 2 weeks in August when Daniel did not leave the ranch except when absolutely necessary, managing the household and his work simultaneously with a calm efficiency that she would have found more touching if she had not been too uncomfortable to be properly appreciative. She told him this later, and he laughed and said that was all right. He had not required appreciation, and she said she was giving it retroactively, which was the best she could manage. Their second son, James, was born in October of 1888, small but determined, with red-gold hair that had no clear precedent in either family, and that prompted an extended and amused conversation about ancestry. He grew up to have his father's gift for focused attention and his mother's stubbornness, which was perhaps the most concentrated combination of parental qualities that could have been arranged. By 1890, the territory was changing in the ways Daniel had predicted years ago, becoming denser with population, with proper legal structures, with the infrastructure that would eventually make it a state. The raw, improvised quality of the 1882 Crestwood that Ida had grown up in was being replaced by something more permanent and regulated, which was mostly good and occasionally had the feeling of something being lost. Ida and Daniel talked about this on the porch in the evenings the way they talked about everything, practically and honestly, acknowledging both the gains and the losses. Crestwood itself had grown. The main street had 3 new businesses, a second doctor, a proper school building with a full-time teacher, and a post office. The bridge over Crestwood Creek had been rebuilt in stone rather than planking and would not require the annual debate about repairs. Mayor Brandt had retired and been replaced by a younger man named Harrison who had been born in the territory and had a different relationship to it than the old arrivals did. The saloon still played piano on Friday nights. Pete Garza's feed store continued to operate, though Pete himself was slower and older and sometimes fell asleep in his chair behind the counter in the afternoons, which his customers understood and worked around. He remained one of the people most often present at the Walker table on Sunday afternoons, when Ida cooked a meal large enough for whoever showed up, and Daniel made coffee, and the children created the particular cheerful noise that children make when they have been set free after a week of school and chores. Martha Kane came too, and old Hector, who had retired from ranch work but lived in a small house on the Holloway property edge that Ida had built for him at his retirement, because she felt it was owed, and occasionally Raphael and his wife Consuela, who had married in 1886, and whose own children ran around the yard with Thomas and Clara and James in the uncomplicated manner of children, who do not yet understand any of the distinctions that the adult world insists upon. It was on one such Sunday afternoon, in the autumn of 1890, that Daniel found Ida standing at the kitchen window looking out at the yard where Thomas, 12 years old now and tall for his age, was teaching Clara, 4 years old, to throw a rope while James, 2, sat in the dust watching them with the intense concentration of someone taking detailed mental notes. The afternoon light was golden and long, and the cottonwood that Ida had planted in the yard the year they married was tall enough now to cast a real shadow, its leaves turning yellow in the autumn air. Daniel came to stand behind her, and she leaned back into him without turning, because she knew exactly where he was. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "My father," she said. "He would have loved this. He would have stood right there and watched those 3 children, and he would have been so content." She paused. "He chose this land for exactly this reason, for exactly this kind of Sunday afternoon." Daniel's arms went around her and she felt his chin rest against the top of her head. "He chose well," Daniel said. "He did," she said. "And so did I." She felt him smile against her hair. Outside, Thomas succeeded in teaching Clara the basic loop, and Clara shrieked with triumph, and James clapped his small hands and fell sideways in the dust and got up again immediately and clapped some more, and the cottonwood leaves drifted down in the gold and gentle air. The ranch stretched out beyond the yard, 460 acres of red territory earth that had been Thomas Holloway's and was now Ida Walker's, secured by law and by testimony, and by a man who had stood up in a town hall on an August evening in 1882 and said those words that had changed the direction of both their lives. The land was hers. It had always been hers. And the life she had built on it, with this man and these children and this community, was the life her father had intended when he had registered that deed in 1862 and pressed into the hard New Mexico soil and believed in the future. Ida Walker believed in it too. She believed in it every morning when she rose before dawn and went out to the land that was hers, every evening when she sat on the porch with Daniel and watched the desert sky turn its extravagant colors, every Sunday afternoon when the house was full of the people she loved, every case that Daniel took and won, and every homesteader who kept their land because of it. She believed in it in the deep, unglamorous, permanent way that you believe in something that has cost you a great deal and proven worth every penny. She turned in Daniel's arms to face him and looked at him the way she had been looking at him for 8 years now, with the same directness and the same certainty, and he looked back at her the same way. "I'm going to need more fence posts for the north pasture," she said. He laughed. "I'll add it to the list. And the south well needs attention before winter." "I know." "And there is a family I heard about from Harrison," she said, her voice shifting slightly. "A family outside of Cedral who received a notice about their property. Something about back taxes that they claim they never owed." Daniel's expression changed in the particular way it did when a case was presenting itself. "Tell me what you know," he said. And she did. They're in the kitchen with the Sunday afternoon light around them and their children outside in the yard and the land stretching out in every direction under the great territory sky. And he listened with the complete, unwavering attention that was one of the things she loved most about him. And then he nodded and said he would ride out to see them tomorrow, and that if it was what it sounded like, they would handle it. They would handle it. Together. As they had handled everything since that August evening, when a cowboy had stood up in the middle of a town meeting and said that the land belonged to her, and had proven it, and had turned out to be the best and most enduring thing that had ever walked into her life. The cottonwood leaves fell in the yard, gold against the red earth, and Thomas and Clara and James played in the long afternoon shadow, And Ida Walker stood in the kitchen of the house her father had built on land that was and would always be hers, in the arms of the man she loved. And the territory spread out around them in all directions, wide and honest and full of everything that was still to come.